Of all the great artists, Caravaggio seems to speak most intensely to the modern world. A man whose art seems obsessed with sexuality and sensuality, youth and beauty, fear and violence, loneliness and intense self-awareness. He lived a brief and tumultuous life, mocking authority, even murdering a man. He spent 4 years on the run, a fugitive from justice, but he always painted, reimagining the most familiar stories in Western culture from the Bible and bringing religious art to life in paintings so powerful and naturalistic that some saw them as miracles in themselves. Caravaggio was born, it's believed, in September 1571 here in Milan. He was christened Michelangelo Merisi, but later adopted the name Caravaggio from the village in which his father owned property, 43 kilometres east of Milan. His father died of the plague when Caravaggio was a young boy, and soon after he became an apprentice to painter Simone Peterzano. When he just turned 20, Caravaggio sold the land he'd inherited from his father and left Milan and the north for good. There are various unsubstantiated reports that he'd spent time in prison in Milan for assaulting a constable, the first in a number of crimes with which Caravaggio was implicated throughout his mysterious life. What's more certain, though, is that when he headed south, he came to the city in which he would make his artistic name, Rome. By the late 16th century, Rome had fallen from grace, lagging far behind Venice, Naples, Florence and Milan. But the Pope, Sixtus V, was seeking to reverse this, and the city was busy with building projects. Caravaggio's early years, however, seem to have been spent in various households and workshops carrying out menial artistic tasks. One of these workshops was that of Giuseppe Cesare d'Arpino, the foremost Roman painter of the day. But the precocious Caravaggio made clear his disregard for the reverence shown to ancient statues and to the art of the Renaissance masters, particularly Michelangelo and Raphael. One day, it's said, when shown some ancient sculptures, Caravaggio pointed instead to a crowd of people in the street, declaring them to be superior models for his art. And it's this proclaimed interest in naturalism that's made evident in two paintings widely believed to be done by Caravaggio while he's still working for Cesare d'Arpino, the first of which takes a young fruit seller off the street. There's a dreamy expression on his face, and he's sensually delighting in the succulent basket of fruit that he clasps to himself. The picture's slightly staged with this raking diagonal lighting that becomes a trademark of Caravaggio's later work. But look at how the work's painted. It's beautiful, dexterous. And it's an exquisitely painted still life of grapes and peaches that arrests the viewer's eye and then draws us into this, the second picture, which is clearly alluding to the Roman god of wine and inspiration, Bacchus. But it's also a self-portrait, and a self-portrait with a twist. Because if you look at those greying lips and those sunken dark eyes, this is an image of Bacchus and Caravaggio that's ill or sick. And I think it's subversive. I think what he's saying is that ancient or classical Roman culture is sick, and perhaps the future is in naturalism. Look at the grapes, how they're painted. They are naturalistic, but at the same time they're turning, which amplifies that idea of illness. The expression on his face is melancholic, and melancholia, in Renaissance and post-Renaissance Italy, is associated with the creative genius. And when you combine that with this crown that he wears on his head, it's as if he's saying, I've arrived. The painting which caught the eye of the Roman art world and announced the dramatic arrival of a new talent was this one, called The Card Sharps. It's a piece of theatre on canvas, a slightly comic moral fable about the gullibility of youth, with a raffishly clothed man and his young accomplice fleecing a young aristocrat at cards. The man peering not so surreptitiously at his hand and gesturing to his sidekick, who reaches for the winning card behind his back. Caravaggio uses the same model for both boys, both practical and perhaps a reference to the potential duality in each of us. Sometime in 1595, the card sharps caught the eye of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, the Medici ambassador to the papal court here in Rome, who lived in the splendid Palazzo Madama just round the corner from the Piazza Navona. And so impressed was the cardinal with Caravaggio's work that he asked the painter to join his household. Whilst Caravaggio was in Del Monte's service, he was commissioned to paint 5 major pictures, the most lyrical and sensual of which was this one. The musicians shows a lute player, a singer and a cornetto player preparing to make music whilst a winged cupid plucks at a bunch of grapes. It's a hedonistic image which builds on Caravaggio's early paintings, but also tries to convey something of the power of music. The boy with the lute has tears in his eyes, as if moved by the sounds around him, and the almost orgasmic look on the face of the cornetto player just behind adds a haunting and erotic dimension to the painting. This may be a self-portrait of the painter, partly angelic, partly mischievous, and with trouble just around the corner. In 1598, Caravaggio was arrested and thrown in prison for illegally carrying a sword, but he was quickly released because he was in the employment of the influential Cardinal del Monte. Subsequently, del Monte was instrumental in Caravaggio winning an important commission, conveniently enough located slap bang next to where Caravaggio was living at the Palazzo Madama. It was for a pair of paintings to be produced for the Contarelli Chapel in this church of San Luigi de Francesi. The commission, both physically and in terms of importance, was by far and away the biggest of Caravaggio's career to date. It came from a French cardinal, Contarelli, who's buried here in the chapel, whose will decreed that he wanted 2 scenes from the life of St. Matthew the Evangelist depicted on his chapel walls. And it's a kind of narrative sequence that Caravaggio produced, which begins with this picture, the calling of St. Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector and a publican, a wealthy man who is confronted by Christ in the tax office, where Christ sees him and says, "Follow me." And it's exactly that moment that Caravaggio tries to bring to life. In a way, it's a picture of 2 halves, with Christ and St. Peter on the right-hand side, dressed in biblical costume. Christ points at St. Matthew, and the viewer's eye is drawn from right to left. And look at the way the light rakes in from the window, illuminating the bearded face of St. Matthew, who points at himself as if to say, "Me?" St. Matthew and his wealthy and slightly loose friends are clad in contemporary Roman costume. And this is part of the power of the painting. It's as if these figures have stepped from out of the Roman back streets and into a bar, although in this case it's a tax office. But actually it looks almost like a gambling den. There's something evocative of Caravaggio's painting of the card sharps, where one figure is looking down at money. St. Matthew has a coin tucked into his hat, as if to amplify their value system. Ultimately, it's a painting of contrast between poverty and wealth, darkness and light, with St. Matthew divinely illuminated. It also contrasts the Roman world in which Caravaggio lived with the biblical one that he wanted to bring to life. It's a simple story, but told in a complex or sophisticated way. And from this, Caravaggio turns his attention to something equally dramatic, but much more garishly violent.